Eliza Reyes arrived at Sunnydale Air Force Base every morning at 4:30 sharp, 90 minutes before the first pilots began their day. Her modest sedan, at least 8 years old, always claimed the same parking spot near the maintenance hangar. The same black coffee in the same blue travel mug, the same measured steps through the entrance that had become as routine as breathing. To everyone on base, Eliza was just another flight simulator technician. Competent, reliable, but unremarkable. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, wore simple navy slacks and regulation shirts, and never joined the other technical staff for weekend gatherings off base. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her colleagues respected her work, but knew almost nothing about her life beyond these walls. Her apartment sat 5 miles from base, a modest one-bedroom with white walls and minimal furnishings. No photographs adorned the surfaces, no medals displayed in shadow boxes, no hints of a life beyond the simple routine she had maintained for 3 years. The only personal touch was a small leather case on her nightstand that she never opened in front of anyone. Eliza's workstation reflected the same simplicity. Tools arranged with mathematical precision. Each simulator she calibrated received the kind of attention most people reserve for priceless art. Other technical staff joked that she treated every flight simulator like it might save the world, never knowing how many times her perfectly calibrated systems actually had. When pressed about her background, Eliza deflected questions with practiced ease. She mentioned general experience with avionics systems, some technical training growing up. Nothing that would raise eyebrows or invite further inquiry. Her movements were efficient but never flashy. Her expertise hidden beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. But every morning before anyone else arrived, Eliza performed a ritual that would have revealed everything. She would stand in the empty simulator bay, eyes closed, running through a complete pre-flight checklist in her mind. Not for calibration, but for remembrance. Each item a memory, a face, a life that had shaped her into someone she could barely recognize anymore. The leather case in her apartment contained a single set of wings, worn smooth by years of handling. A name, she whispered during those morning exercises. One soul who had trusted her with their life and lost it anyway. The weight of those wings had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. Eliza Reyes was a ghost in more ways than one. She had deliberately erased every trace of who she used to be. Every hint of the skills that had once made her name whispered in reverence and awe across 3 continents. The quiet technician who arrived early and left late, who never missed a calibration and never complained about system updates, was exactly what she wanted to be. But ghosts have a way of being discovered, especially when they try too hard to stay hidden. And at Sunnydale, where military precision met civilian oversight, where young pilots learned to trust their instruments with their lives, the past had a way of catching up with those who thought they could outrun it. The morning Eliza's carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble started like any other. Coffee, mental checklists, and the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she began another day of technical work. She had no way of knowing that Major Deanna Winters had been watching her for weeks, or that her observations would soon shatter the peaceful obscurity Eliza had worked so hard to build. The first sign of trouble came when Winters appeared in the simulator bay earlier than usual, her polished boots clicking against the floor with deliberate authority. She carried herself like a woman who had never doubted her place in the world, never questioned her right to judge others. Her eyes swept the workspace with the confidence of someone looking for problems rather than solutions. Eliza felt her gaze settle on her workstation, measuring and evaluating with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. She continued her work without acknowledgement, focusing on the simulator calibration that had become second nature. But something in the air had changed. A tension that made her shoulders tighten despite her best efforts to remain calm. Winter's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "Reyes, isn't it? I've been reviewing your personnel file." The words carried an edge that made other technical staff glance up from their work, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded storms. Eliza looked up from her work, meeting Winter's gaze with the same neutral expression she wore like armor. "Yes, ma'am." "Is there something you need?" "Just getting to know our civilian technicians better," Winters replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Making sure everyone understands the standards we maintain here at Sunnydale." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Eliza had dealt with people like Winters before, officers who confused authority with competence, who mistook volume for leadership. She nodded politely and returned to her work, hoping silence would end the conversation before it could begin. But Winters wasn't finished. 3 years here, and you've never applied for additional certification, never sought advancement. Most technicians show some ambition. The question carried undertones that made Eliza's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had learned to read people like Winters, to understand the games they played and the insecurities that drove them. This was about more than performance reviews or career advancement. This was about control, about establishing dominance in a world where Winters felt her authority might be questioned. "I'm satisfied with my current position," Eliza replied evenly. "The work is meaningful." Winters' laugh carried no humor. "Meaningful? You calibrate simulators, Reyes. Important work, certainly, but let's not pretend it requires special expertise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The words stung more than they should have, cutting through defenses Eliza had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because it was meaningful, because every simulator she calibrated might keep someone's son or daughter alive in a place where precision meant survival. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "I understand, ma'am," she said instead, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Winters studied her for a long moment, as if expecting some reaction she could use to justify whatever she had already decided. When none came, she moved on to inspect other workstations. But Eliza could feel her attention returning to her throughout the morning, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. The other technical staff exchanged glances after Winters left, their expressions mixing sympathy with relief that they hadn't been the target of her scrutiny. Eliza appreciated their unspoken support, but she also understood the reality of their situation. Winters' authority extended far beyond the simulator bay, and none of them could afford to make her an enemy. As the day progressed, Eliza found herself thinking about the leather case in her apartment, about the name she carried and the reasons she had chosen this life. She had thought 3 years of anonymity would be enough, that she could serve quietly without anyone questioning her qualifications or her past. But people like Winters didn't believe in quiet service. They believed in hierarchy, in putting people in their proper places, in making sure everyone understood exactly where they stood. The afternoon brought new challenges as Winters returned with additional questions about her work methods, her efficiency reports, and her interaction with base personnel. Each inquiry felt like a probe, testing for weaknesses she could exploit. Eliza answered with professional courtesy, but inside she felt the familiar stirring of instincts she had worked hard to suppress. She had faced down weather conditions that would terrify seasoned pilots, had stared death in the face, and pulled through impossible maneuvers when necessary. But this was different. This was about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the service she provided without recognition or glory. Winters threatened all of that with her questions and her assumptions, and her obvious intent to find fault where none existed. As the day ended and Eliza prepared to leave for her apartment, she carried with her the certainty that this was only the beginning. Winters had marked her as a target, and people like her didn't give up easily. The quiet technician who had hoped to serve without notice was about to discover that some fights chose you, regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. The drive home gave her time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever Winters had in mind. She had survived worse than office politics and petty authority. But she had also learned that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with aircraft, but with patience, with precision, and with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself to be effective. Eliza Reyes was about to be tested in ways she hadn't expected. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of careful anonymity and deliberate ordinariness, the pilot began to stir. The harassment began subtly, the way it always did with people like Major Winters. Winters' campaign against Eliza escalated with each passing day, becoming more personal and increasingly difficult to ignore. She began showing up at her workstation multiple times daily, finding new ways to question her methods, her efficiency, and her right to be there. The harassment had evolved from professional criticism to something that felt deeply personal. The other technical staff grew increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They watched Winters' behavior with growing unease, recognizing the systematic nature of her campaign. Some tried to offer Eliza subtle support, sharing workloads when possible, providing silent gestures of solidarity. But their help came with limitations. Winters' authority extended far beyond the simulator bay, and everyone understood the cost of making her an enemy. Eliza absorbed each slight with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything else. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The careful control she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack under the constant pressure. She found herself thinking about the leather case in her apartment more often, about the name she carried and the skills she had deliberately buried. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. Winters arrived with a delegation of officers, ostensibly to review calibration protocols, but clearly designed to provide her with an audience for whatever she had planned. Eliza watched them enter the facility with the same sinking feeling she had once experienced when her aircraft warning systems detected unexpected threats. "Today we're going to review some concerns about technician performance," Winters announced to the assembled group. "Specifically questions about whether civilian personnel truly understand the standards required in military aviation." The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Eliza's competence, but her right to work alongside military personnel. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room as Winters prepared to make her an example of everything she believed was wrong with civilian technicians. "Reyes," Winters called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted her right to judge others. "Show me that simulator calibration you completed yesterday." Eliza moved to the flight simulator she had thoroughly calibrated the previous day. Every system had been checked, every response time measured, every potential variance accounted for with a level of precision that consistently impressed her supervisors. She had performed the same procedure hundreds of times with results that exceeded military standards. Winters began examining the calibration logs with exaggerated care, making notes on her clipboard and exchanging meaningful looks with her audience. "These response times show inconsistencies," Winters announced, pointing to measurements that fell well within acceptable parameters. "The kind of variance that suggests someone who doesn't understand the critical nature of flight instruments." The accusation was absurd. Eliza had calibrated simulators with a level of precision that bordered on artistry, treating each system as if it might save someone's life in flight because she understood better than most that it might. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "Ma'am, those measurements are all within the acceptable parameters defined by Air Force regulations," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Winters' expression suggested she considered Eliza's response a form of insubordination. Parameters, Reyes, or your interpretation of parameters. Because there's a difference between following specifications and following your own judgment. The emphasis on your own judgment made it clear that the criticism extended beyond technical competence to something more fundamental. Winters wasn't just questioning her methods. She was questioning her right to make decisions about aviation equipment. The implication that she was somehow unqualified to calibrate systems that she understood better than anyone in the room was almost too much to bear. "I follow all established protocols, ma'am," Eliza repeated, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Winters turned to address her audience, using Eliza's presence as a teaching moment about the dangers of lowering standards. "This is what happens when we prioritize diversity over competence," she announced. "When we allow civilian technicians to handle equipment that should only be touched by qualified Air Force personnel." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years proving her competence through flawless performance, had calibrated simulators with a level of precision that consistently impressed her supervisors. But Winters was reducing all of that to a diversity hire, a charity case who had been given opportunities she hadn't earned. Furthermore, Winters continued, her confidence growing as she sensed no resistance from her target, "I have serious concerns about security protocols. Civilian technicians with access to military simulators require closer supervision than we've been providing." The implication was clear and devastating. Winters wasn't just questioning her competence. She was questioning her loyalty, her trustworthiness, her right to be trusted with the systems that kept pilots safe. The accusation of potential security violations could end her career and destroy any chance of working in military contracting again. Eliza felt something snap inside her. A control mechanism that had been under strain for weeks, finally reaching its breaking point. She had endured the harassment, absorbed the criticism, and accepted the systematic campaign to undermine her work. But this went too far. This threatened not just her job, but her identity, her sense of purpose, her ability to serve in the only way she had left. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the room look up with surprise. "I've calibrated every simulator on this base to standards that have never been questioned by qualified supervisors. My work has consistently exceeded every metric established by this facility." Winters' eyes narrowed at what she clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. "Reyes, I think you're forgetting who you're talking to. I'm not interested in your excuses or your attempts to defend substandard performance." The dismissal was intended to end the conversation, to put Eliza back in her place and demonstrate her authority to the assembled officers. But something in Eliza's expression made her pause, a stillness that didn't match the submissive technician she had been systematically destroying. "With respect, ma'am," Eliza continued, her voice carrying a quality that made the room grow quiet, "I'm not offering excuses, I'm stating facts. Every simulator I've calibrated has performed flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. Every pilot who has trained on equipment I've serviced has completed their training safely. That's not opinion, Major. That's measurable reality." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Winters had expected submission, apology, maybe even tears. Instead, she faced quiet defiance, backed by 3 years of flawless performance. The room watched in fascination as the dynamic shifted, as the quiet technician revealed depths that no one had suspected. "Are you questioning my judgment, Reyes?" Winters demanded, her voice rising with indignation. Eliza met her gaze directly, her eyes carrying something that made several officers shift uncomfortably. "I'm questioning the basis for your conclusions, ma'am, because they don't match the evidence." The confrontation had escalated beyond what Winters had intended. She had planned to humiliate a civilian technician to make an example that would reinforce her authority. Instead, she found herself facing someone who refused to be intimidated, who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "You're dismissed, Reyes," Winters said finally, her voice tight, with barely controlled anger. "Report to my office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss your future here." Eliza nodded once, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had crossed a line, challenged authority in a way that would have consequences. But she had also discovered something about herself that 3 years of careful anonymity had nearly buried. She wasn't just Eliza Reyes, civilian technician. She was someone who had faced down impossible conditions, who had stared death in the face and pulled through maneuvers that defied physics when necessary. As she left the facility, Eliza felt the weight of every gaze following her. Some sympathetic, others merely curious about how this confrontation would unfold. But she also felt something else stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. The pilot was waking up, and Eliza wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Eliza spent the night staring at the leather case on her nightstand, wrestling with decisions that would determine not just her future, but her identity. The confrontation with Winters had awakened something she had worked hard to suppress. Part of herself that she had thought buried with her wingman in the mountains of Afghanistan. The quiet technician who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights couldn't be avoided. She opened the case and lifted out the wings, letting them rest in her palm like a prayer. A name that had trusted her with their life and lost it anyway. The weight of those wings had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. But Winters' campaign was threatening even this simple form of service. The morning brought new clarity. Eliza arrived at the base early as always, but this time she carried herself differently. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. She performed her morning ritual with new purpose. Each item on her mental checklist a name, a promise, a reminder of why service mattered. Winters' office was exactly what she expected. Military precision disguised as personal importance, with awards and photographs that spoke more to ambition than accomplishment. She kept Eliza waiting for 20 minutes, a power play designed to emphasize the difference in their positions. When she was finally admitted, Winters' expression made it clear that she expected submission and apology. "Reyes," she began, settling behind her desk with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to judge others. "I trust you've had time to reflect on yesterday's incident." Eliza met her gaze directly, her eyes carrying something that made Winters pause. "Yes, ma'am. I've reflected on a great deal." The response wasn't what Winters had expected. She had planned to accept Eliza's apology and then outline the terms of her punishment. Instead, she found herself facing someone who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "Good," Winters said, recovering quickly. "Then you understand that your behavior yesterday was unacceptable." Questioning. A superior officer in front of witnesses cannot be tolerated. Eliza nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. "I understand your perspective, ma'am. But I also understand the difference between authority and competence. And I know the difference between following orders and following conscience." The words carried an edge that made Winters' expression harden. She had expected contrition, maybe even tears. Instead, she faced quiet defiance backed by something she couldn't quite identify. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the balance of power had shifted in ways she didn't understand. "Are you threatening me, Reyes?" Winters demanded, her voice rising with indignation. Eliza's response came quietly, but with absolute certainty. "I'm stating facts, ma'am. My work has been flawless for 3 years. Every simulator I've calibrated has performed exactly as designed. Every pilot who's trained on equipment I've serviced has completed their training safely. That's not opinion, Major. That's measurable reality." Winters leaned forward, her face flushed with anger. "Your work, Reyes? You're a civilian technician, with no military background. You calibrate simulators according to procedures written by people who actually understand aviation. Don't confuse following instructions with expertise. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Eliza felt something stirring inside her, a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. She had spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities, serving without recognition or glory. But Winter's systematic campaign had pushed her to a breaking point where silence was no longer an option. "You're right about one thing, ma'am," Eliza said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Winters pause. "I do understand the difference between following instructions and having expertise. The question is whether you do." The confrontation had escalated beyond what either of them had planned. Winters had expected to intimidate a civilian technician into submission. Instead, she found herself facing someone who refused to be cowed, who possessed a confidence that seemed to grow with each exchange. "You're dismissed, Reyes," Winters said finally, her voice tied with barely controlled anger. "Clean out your workstation. Your contract is terminated effective immediately." Eliza stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long night of reflection. But she had also made a decision that would change everything. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, "I believe you should reconsider that decision." Winter's eyes narrowed at what she clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. "Are you telling me how to run my command, Reyes?" Eliza met her gaze directly, her expression carrying something that made the room grow quiet. "I'm telling you that you're making a mistake. A mistake that will reflect poorly on your judgment when the full truth comes out." The words carried an implication that made Winters pause. There was something in Eliza's tone, in her bearing, that suggested she possessed information Winters didn't have. The quiet technician who had been systematically destroyed was revealing depths that no one had suspected. What truth? Winters demanded, her voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Eliza's response came with the precision of someone who had calculated every word. The truth about competence versus authority, about service versus self-promotion, about the difference between earning respect and demanding it. She turned to leave, but Winter's voice stopped her at the door. "Reyes, I'm not finished with you." Eliza looked back over her shoulder, her expression carrying something that made Winter's blood run cold. "Actually, ma'am, I think you are. But I'm not finished with you." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Winters watched her leave with growing unease, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their dynamic. The quiet technician who had absorbed weeks of harassment had revealed glimpses of someone who possessed capabilities she couldn't understand. As Eliza walked back to the simulator facility, she felt the weight of every gaze following her. Word of her termination had spread quickly, and her colleagues watched with expressions mixing sympathy with curiosity. They understood what they had witnessed, the public destruction of someone who had served faithfully for 3 years. But Eliza carried herself differently now, with a confidence that seemed completely out of place for someone who had just lost her job. She began packing her tools with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, but her movements carried new purpose. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was cracking, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. Technical Sergeant James Chun, the facility's senior technical advisor, approached her workstation with obvious concern. He had worked with Eliza for 2 years and understood her capabilities better than most. Her termination made no sense from a performance standpoint. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this doesn't reflect how any of us see your work. You've been the best technician we've ever had." Eliza looked up from her packing, her expression carrying something that made him pause. "Thank you, James. That means more than you know." Shun studied her face, noting something different in her bearing. Are you going to be okay? Because I know some people who might be interested in your skills." Eliza's smile carried depths. That hadn't been there before. "I'll be fine, James. Sometimes things work out in ways we don't expect." The response puzzled him, but before he could ask for clarification, Eliza had returned to her packing. She moved with new purpose, as if her termination had freed her from constraints that had been holding her back. The quiet technician who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. As she carried her tools to her car, Eliza felt something stirring inside her that had been dormant for too long. The pilot was waking up, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. But maybe, she thought, it was time to stop trying. Winters had made a mistake. She had pushed too hard, had threatened the only form of service. Eliza had left, and now she was about to discover that some people were dangerous precisely because they had nothing left to lose. The war between Major Winters and Eliza Reyes was about to begin in earnest, and Winters had no idea what she had awakened. Eliza's termination sent ripples through the base that Winters hadn't anticipated. Within hours of her departure, 3 separate incidents occurred that would have been routine calibration issues if she had still been there. A flight simulator that showed inconsistent readings during training exercises. A navigation system that lost accuracy during a qualification course. A response mechanism that failed safety inspection. None of the incidents were catastrophic, but they highlighted the gap left by Eliza's departure in ways that made Winters increasingly uncomfortable. The remaining technical staff worked overtime to address the problems, but their efforts lacked the precision and efficiency that had made Eliza's work legendary among those who understood aviation systems. Technical Sergeant Chun found himself fielding questions from frustrated instructors about why equipment that had been flawlessly maintained for 3 years was suddenly experiencing problems. He knew the answer, but explaining it would require challenging Winters' decision directly. Instead, he filed reports that documented the decreased efficiency and increased maintenance times without explicitly connecting them to Eliza's termination. Meanwhile, Eliza used her newfound freedom to investigate Winters' background more thoroughly. She visited public records offices, accessed Air Force databases through contacts who still owed her favors, and made discreet inquiries among friends who could provide information about officers who had served in the Middle East. What she discovered painted a picture of a woman whose reputation far exceeded her actual accomplishments. Winters' service record showed 2 tours in Iraq, but both had been spent in administrative roles at major air bases. She had never flown combat missions, never commanded pilots under fire, never faced the kind of life-or-death decisions that forged real aviation leaders. Her awards and commendations reflected competent desk work rather than airborne courage. The contrast between Winters' self-presentation and her actual experience was stark. She spoke with the authority of someone who had led pilots in combat, but her record showed someone who had managed paperwork while others flew. The medals she displayed prominently in her office were for administrative excellence and logistical support, not for valor or leadership under fire. Eliza also discovered that Winters' assignment to Sunnydale had come after a complaint about her management style at her previous posting. The details were buried in personnel files she couldn't fully access, but the pattern was clear. Winters had been transferred to a position where her authority was limited and her impact on operational readiness was minimal. The investigation revealed something else that made Eliza's blood run cold. Winters had been quietly targeting other civilian technicians, using the same systematic harassment tactics she had employed against her. 3 technicians had been terminated in the past 6 months. All women, all with performance records that exceeded established standards. The pattern was unmistakable. Winters wasn't just incompetent. She was actively dangerous to the base's operational readiness. Her campaign against qualified personnel was degrading the very capabilities she was supposed to protect. The irony wasn't lost on Eliza, the woman who questioned her commitment to military excellence was actively undermining it through her own prejudices and insecurities. Armed with this information, Eliza began reaching out to contacts she had avoided for 3 years. The aviation community was smaller than most people realized, especially among those who had served in special operations. Phone calls were made, emails were sent, and old debts of trust were quietly called in. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, Eliza had compiled a dossier on Winters that revealed the full scope of her incompetence. Former colleagues spoke privately about her failures of leadership, her tendency to take credit for others' work, and her pattern of targeting subordinates who threatened her authority through their competence. More importantly, Eliza discovered that several high-ranking officers had been quietly monitoring Winters' performance at Sunnydale. Her systematic harassment of civilian technicians had not gone unnoticed, but they had been waiting for someone to file a formal complaint. Eliza's termination had provided the catalyst they needed to take action. Colonel Marcus Alvarez arrived at Sunnydale Air Force Base 3 days after Eliza's termination, ostensibly for a routine inspection of training protocols. But his real purpose was to investigate reports of declining simulator standards and technician harassment. Alvarez had served with distinction in multiple combat zones and understood the critical importance of simulator accuracy to pilot safety. His inspection was thorough and methodical. He reviewed maintenance records, interviewed staff, and personally tested simulators that had been calibrated by different technicians. The difference in quality between Eliza's work and that of her replacements was immediately apparent to someone with his experience. When Alvarez requested to speak with Eliza Reyes, Winters' response was telling. She provided a lengthy explanation of why her contract had been terminated, emphasizing security concerns and performance issues that had no basis in documented fact. Alvarez listened with professional courtesy, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as Winters' accusations became more elaborate. "Major," Alvarez interrupted finally, "I've reviewed Reyes's performance records. They show 3 years of flawless service with consistently high ratings from every supervisor except you. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Winters' face flushed with anger at what she perceived as an attack on her authority. "Colonel, with respect, you haven't worked with Reyes directly. I have observed problems that may not be apparent in written reports." Alvarez nodded thoughtfully, making notes on his tablet. "I see. And these problems coincided with your arrival at Sunnydale?" "Because the timeline suggests that Reyes's performance ratings declined only after you began supervising her work." The implication was clear and damaging. Winters had created problems where none had existed, had manufactured reasons to target a technician whose work had been exemplary under previous supervision. Her systematic campaign was documented in her own reports, creating a paper trail that revealed more about her prejudices than Eliza's performance. "Colonel," Winters said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "I believe my authority to evaluate technician performance is well established. I don't appreciate having my judgment questioned." Alvarez's response was measured, but firm. "Major, your authority to evaluate performance is indeed established. Your judgment, however, is subject to review when it impacts operational readiness, and declining simulator standards directly impact the safety of our pilots." The conversation continued for another hour, with Alvarez systematically dismantling Winters' justifications for Eliza's termination. Every accusation was countered with documented evidence of her competence. Every security concern was revealed as baseless speculation. Every performance issue was shown to be a manufactured complaint. Meanwhile, Eliza received a phone call that changed everything. Colonel Alvarez had requested a meeting, not as a terminated technician, but as someone whose expertise might be valuable to ongoing operations. The call came through channels that Eliza hadn't used in 3 years. Contacts who understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning, away from the base and away from Winter's influence. Eliza arrived with the dossier she had compiled on Winter's background, prepared to present evidence that would expose her systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Alvarez greeted her with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. He had done his own research and made his own inquiries, and had reached conclusions that would have shocked Winters if she had been present to hear them. "Ms. Reyes," Alvarez began, "I believe we need to discuss not just your termination, but the circumstances that led to it. And perhaps more importantly, we need to discuss who you really are." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eliza had spent 3 years hiding her true identity, serving without recognition or glory, but Alvarez's expression suggested that her carefully maintained anonymity had been penetrated by someone who understood the value of her real capabilities. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Eliza replied, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what he meant. Alvarez smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had solved a puzzle that had been troubling him. "I think you do, Ms. Reyes, or should I say Captain Reyes, call sign Phoenix?" The name hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years believing that her past was buried, that her service record was classified beyond any possibility of discovery. But Alvarez's expression made it clear that some secrets were impossible to keep from those who knew where to look. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eliza said, but her voice lacked conviction. Alvarez leaned forward, his expression serious. 12 successful missions in hostile airspace. 4 confirmed air-to-air victories against superior forces. The midnight extraction of an intelligence team from Tehran that aviation experts still discuss in hushed tones. The test pilot who could handle experimental aircraft that had claimed the lives of 2 other pilots. Each detail landed with the force of absolute truth. Eliza felt the carefully constructed walls of her anonymity crumbling as Alvarez revealed the extent of his knowledge. The pilot that she had thought buried was being systematically exhumed by someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with. "That person is dead," Eliza said finally, her voice carrying the weight of loss and regret. "She died with her wingman in Afghanistan." Alvarez nodded with understanding. "Maybe she did. But the person sitting across from me calibrated simulators for 3 years with a level of precision that only someone with her skills could achieve. The person Winters targeted and terminated is someone whose expertise exceeds that of anyone on this base." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of what Alvarez had discovered. Winters' systematic harassment had been documented and investigated. Her pattern of targeting qualified personnel had been exposed and analyzed. Her impact on operational readiness had been measured and found wanting. More importantly, Alvarez had authorization to take corrective action. Winters' career at Sunnydale was over, and her influence over technician assignments was terminated immediately. Eliza's contract would be reinstated with a formal apology and compensation for wrongful termination. But Alvarez offered something more than just vindication. He offered Eliza the chance to serve in a capacity that would utilize her real capabilities, to train the next generation of pilots in skills that could save their lives in combat. "The choice is yours," Alvarez said. "You can return to technical work, serving quietly as you have for 3 years, or you can step out of the shadows and teach others what you know. Help them become the kind of pilots who might survive what your wingman didn't." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Eliza had spent 3 years serving without recognition, hiding her capabilities behind the mask of ordinary competence. But Alvarez was offering her the chance to serve openly, to use her skills to prepare others for the challenges she had faced. It was a chance to honor the memory of her fallen wingmen by ensuring that future pilots were better prepared. trained, better equipped to survive in hostile territory. It was a chance to transform her guilt into purpose, her loss into legacy. Eliza looked at Alvarez with new understanding. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" The smile that crossed his face was answer enough. The pilot was about to return to the cockpit, and Winters was about to discover that some enemies were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Colonel Alvarez's investigation moved with military efficiency and devastating thoroughness. Within 72 hours of his arrival, he had compiled a comprehensive report that documented Winters' systematic harassment of civilian technicians, her impact on operational readiness, and her pattern of manufacturing complaints against qualified personnel. The report painted a picture of leadership failure that went beyond simple incompetence. Winters had actively degraded the base's capabilities through her prejudices and insecurities, creating problems where none had existed and driving away expertise that was crucial to pilot safety. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Winters remained unaware of the investigation until Alvarez requested a formal meeting with the base commander. The session was scheduled for Thursday morning, with Winters' presence required to address concerns about technician management and operational readiness. She attended expecting to defend her decisions, not her career. The conference room was filled with officers whose ranks and experience dwarfed Winters' credentials. Base Commander Colonel Patricia Morales presided over the meeting with the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. Alvarez presented his findings with clinical precision, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. "Major Winters," Morales began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we're here to discuss serious concerns about your management of civilian technicians and the impact on this base's operational readiness." Winters' face flushed with indignation at what she perceived as an attack on her authority. "Ma'am, I believe my evaluation methods are well within established parameters. I've been implementing necessary corrections to substandard performance." Alvarez looked up from his report, his expression skeptical. "Major, could you explain why simulator accuracy has declined by 35% since Ms. Reyes' termination? Why 3 separate system failures occurred in the first week after her departure?" The question struck at the heart of Winters' justifications. Her campaign against Eliza had been based on manufactured complaints about her performance, but the actual results of her absence told a different story. The base's operational readiness had measurably declined without her expertise. "Those incidents were coincidental," Winters replied, her voice betraying growing uncertainty. "Equipment failures happen regardless of maintenance personnel." Morales consulted the report in front of her, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. "Major, this analysis shows that equipment failures under Reyes's maintenance were virtually non-existent. 3 years of service with 0 documented failures. Can you explain why her termination was necessary given this record?" Winters' prepared justifications crumbled under scrutiny that revealed them as baseless speculation rather than documented fact. Every accusation she had made was countered with evidence of Eliza's competence. Every security concern was shown to be manufactured prejudice. Every performance issue was exposed as systematic harassment. "Furthermore," Alvarez continued, his voice carrying the authority of verified truth, "our investigation has revealed that Ms. Reyes possesses qualifications that far exceed those of any technical personnel on this base. Qualifications that you were apparently unaware of when you terminated her contract." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Winters had destroyed the career of someone whose expertise exceeded her own, had driven away capabilities that were crucial to the base's mission. Her ignorance of Eliza's true qualifications made her actions appear even more egregious. "I evaluated Reyes based on her documented civilian background," Winters protested. "Her personnel file shows no military experience, no formal training beyond basic technical courses." Alvarez's smile carried no warmth. "Major, Personnel files show what individuals want them to show. Ms. Reyes's actual qualifications are classified at levels you don't have access to, but I can tell you that she has more flight experience than everyone in this room combined. The revelation struck Winters like a physical blow. She had spent weeks systematically destroying someone whose credentials made her own service appear insignificant by comparison. The quiet technician she had dismissed as a diversity hire possessed capabilities that she couldn't comprehend. "That's impossible," Winters managed, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Reyes is just a civilian technician with no military background." Morales looked at Winters with growing disappointment. "Major, your inability to recognize expertise when it's serving under your command raises serious questions about your fitness for leadership. You've systematically harassed and ultimately terminated the most qualified technical expert this base has ever had." The meeting continued for another hour, with Alvarez methodically presenting evidence of Winters' failures. Her pattern of targeting female technicians was documented and analyzed. Her impact on morale and operational readiness was measured and found catastrophic. Her abuse of authority was exposed as a pattern of behavior that had followed her from previous assignments. As the evidence mounted, Winters' defense became increasingly desperate. She accused Alvarez of bias, questioned the validity of classified information she couldn't access, and suggested that the investigation was motivated by political correctness rather than operational concerns. But every accusation only revealed her own prejudices more clearly. Her inability to recognize Eliza's qualifications spoke to a fundamental failure of leadership. Her systematic harassment demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was incompatible with Air Force values. Her impact on operational readiness showed that her authority had been used to degrade rather than enhance the base's capabilities. The meeting concluded with Winters' immediate suspension, pending a formal review of her conduct. Her authority over technician assignments was terminated, and her access to personnel files was revoked. The investigation would continue, but her career at Sunnydale was effectively over. Meanwhile, Eliza received another phone call that changed everything. Colonel Alvarez had authorization to offer her a position that would utilize her real capabilities, a chance to serve openly rather than hiding behind manufactured anonymity. The offer came with rank recognition and the opportunity to train the next generation of pilots in skills that could save their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. Winters' campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value to those who understood excellence when they saw it. Her systematic harassment had backfired spectacularly, exposing her own incompetence while highlighting Eliza's expertise. But Eliza's response surprised everyone who thought they understood her motivations. She declined the offer of rank and recognition, choosing instead to return to Sunnydale as a civilian flight instructor with authority to establish training programs that emphasized precision, discipline, and the kind of attention to detail that separated life from death in combat situations. "I'm not interested in titles or ceremonies," she told Alvarez during their final meeting. "I'm interested in making sure the next generation of pilots is better prepared than my wingman was. Better trained, better equipped, better led." Alvarez nodded with understanding. "And Winters? What do you want to see happen to her?" Eliza's answer revealed the depth of her character and the source of her strength. "I want her to understand the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it, between serving yourself and serving something larger." The response was more devastating than any formal punishment could have been. Eliza wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice, not for herself, but for every qualified person who had been driven away by leaders who confused prejudice with judgment. Winters' confrontation with the truth came when she was summoned to a final meeting with Base Commander Morales. The session was brief and final. Her career at Sunnydale terminated with prejudice, and her conduct documented in a way that would follow her for the rest of her military service. But the real reckoning came when Winters encountered Eliza outside the base commander's office. She was returning from a meeting about her new position, carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose value had finally been recognized. Their eyes met for a moment that contained entire conversations. "Reyes," Winters said, her voice lacking the authority it had once carried. Eliza studied her with the dispassion of someone evaluating an aircraft's instrument readings. "Major," Winters' face flushed with anger and humiliation, "you destroyed my career." Eliza's response came with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had happened. "No, ma'am. You destroyed your own career when you confused prejudice with leadership. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself with." The words carried no anger, no satisfaction, just the terrible clarity of absolute truth. Winters had created her own downfall through her systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Eliza had simply documented her failures and presented them to people who understood the value of competence over connections. As Winters walked away from Sunnydale for the last time, Eliza felt something that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice had been served. That excellence had been recognized and incompetence had been exposed. The pilot was returning to the cockpit, and she was bringing with her the promise that future aviators would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her wingmen. Winters' campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value, transforming a simulator technician into an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations. The war was over, and competence had triumphed over authority. But for Eliza, the real victory wasn't Winters' defeat. It was the opportunity to serve openly, to honor her fallen wingman by preparing others for survival in a world where precision meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag. Word of Winters' downfall spread through Sunnydale with the speed of a supersonic aircraft. Within hours, the story had transformed from whispered speculation to confirmed fact. The major who had terrorized civilian technicians was gone, her authority stripped away by an investigation that had exposed systematic harassment and operational incompetence. But the bigger story was just beginning to emerge. Eliza Reyes, the quiet simulator technician who had absorbed weeks of abuse without complaint, was scheduled to address the entire base during the next mandatory formation. The announcement came through official channels, but the undercurrents of anticipation suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen. The formation assembled on Thursday morning with an energy that was unusual for routine administrative briefings. Pilots who had witnessed Winters' campaign against Eliza mixed with others who had only heard rumors about the investigation. Technical staff stood together, their expressions mixing vindication with curiosity about what their former colleague might reveal. Colonel Alvarez introduced Eliza with words that made the assembled personnel lean forward with interest. "Today, you'll hear from someone whose service to this country exemplifies the highest ideals of military excellence. Someone whose expertise has been hidden in plain sight, calibrating the simulators that keep you safe with a level of precision that few people could achieve." Eliza approached the podium with the same measured steps she had used to walk to her workstation every morning for 3 years. But something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The careful anonymity she had maintained was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide her capabilities. She looked out over the assembled personnel, her gaze taking in faces she had served without recognition, simulators she had calibrated without glory, young men and women who deserved to know the truth about excellence in service and the difference between authority and competence. "My name is Eliza Reyes," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "For 3 years, I've calibrated your simulators. I've ensured that every response time, every control surface, every instrument reading met the standards that might save your life in flight. You knew me as a civilian technician who kept to herself and did good work." The formation listened with growing attention as Eliza continued. What you didn't know is that I understood those systems better than most because I had used them in combat. Because I had flown 57 missions across 3 continents. Because I had trusted my life to instruments calibrated by people who understood. That precision isn't just a technical requirement. It's the difference between coming home and a folded flag. The revelation rippled through the formation like electricity. Pilots who had worked alongside Eliza for years suddenly understood that the quiet technician had been something extraordinary, hiding in plain sight. The technical staff felt vindicated in their respect for her work, understanding now why her standards had been so exacting. I came to Sunnydale not for recognition or advancement, Eliza continued, but for the chance to serve without the burden of being remembered, to calibrate simulators with the knowledge that every system I touched might keep someone's son or daughter alive in places where precision determined survival. Her voice carried the weight of hard-won experience as she described a different kind of service. Not the glory of combat missions, but the quiet dedication of ensuring that others would be better prepared for challenges she had faced. The humility of expertise applied without fanfare. Competence demonstrated through results rather than rhetoric. Major Winters questioned my qualifications because she couldn't see past her own assumptions. She created problems where none existed because she confused authority with competence. She degraded this base's operational readiness because she let prejudice override judgment. The condemnation was delivered without anger, but with the terrible clarity of absolute truth. Winter's failures were exposed not through personal attack, but through the simple recitation of facts that spoke for themselves. The real tragedy, Eliza continued, isn't what she did to me. It's what she did to this base's culture. She created an environment where competence was questioned, where excellence was suspect, where service without recognition was dismissed as inadequacy. The formation listened in complete silence as Eliza painted a picture of leadership failure that went beyond simple harassment. Winters had systematically undermined the values that made military service meaningful, had confused position with purpose, had forgotten that true authority came from earning respect rather than demanding it. But this isn't about Major Winters, Eliza said, her voice growing stronger. This is about the choice every leader faces between building others up or tearing them down, between recognizing excellence wherever it appears or only valuing what fits your expectations. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the formation with the intensity of someone who had seen too much to waste words on empty platitudes. I'm returning to Sunnydale, not as a simulator technician, but as an instructor. Not to hide my capabilities, but to share them. Not to serve without recognition, but to prepare you for the challenges that claimed my wingman. The announcement transformed the entire dynamic of the formation. Eliza wasn't just returning, she was emerging from anonymity to take on a role that would utilize her real capabilities. The pilot was returning to the cockpit, bringing with her expertise that could save lives and knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost. My wingman died in Afghanistan because we weren't prepared for what we faced, Eliza continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory and loss. Not because we lacked courage or training, but because we trusted incomplete intelligence and underestimated our adversaries. He died believing in something larger than himself, serving something more important than his own survival. The formation felt the shift from administrative briefing to something approaching sacred testimony. Eliza was sharing not just her credentials, but her scars, not just her expertise, but her vulnerability. The quiet technician was revealing herself as someone who had paid the ultimate price for service and chosen to transform that loss into legacy. His sacrifice will not be meaningless if I can prepare you better than we were prepared. If I can teach you to see what we missed, to question what we accepted, to survive what we didn't. Eliza's voice grew stronger as she described her vision for training that went beyond technical competence to tactical wisdom. Programs that emphasized attention to detail, situational awareness, and the kind of thinking that separated survivors from casualties in hostile environments. Excellence doesn't announce itself, she concluded. It demonstrates itself through results. Competence speaks through action, not argument. True strength lies in lifting others to heights they never thought possible. The formation stood in complete silence as Eliza stepped back from the podium. The transformation was complete. The quiet technician had become an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations. The pilot had returned to the cockpit, bringing with her the promise that future aviators would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her wingmen. Colonel Alvarez returned to the podium with obvious satisfaction. Ms. Reyes will be establishing new training protocols that emphasize precision, discipline, and tactical thinking. These programs will be mandatory for all pilots and will represent some of the most advanced instruction available anywhere in the Air Force. The announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from pilots who understood they were being offered training from someone whose credentials exceeded those of any instructor they had ever encountered. The quiet technician had become a legend in plain sight, her expertise finally recognized and utilized. As the formation dispersed, Eliza found herself surrounded by pilots seeking guidance, asking questions, and expressing gratitude for her willingness to share knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost. The isolation she had maintained for 3 years was replaced by engagement that felt meaningful and purposeful. Technical Sergeant Chun approached her with obvious respect. "Ma'am, I always knew your work was special, but I never imagined it came from experience like that." Eliza's response reflected the humility that had defined her service. "The work was always the important part, James. The background just explains why I took it seriously." The simplicity of her answer captured everything that Winters had failed to understand. Excellence didn't require recognition to be valuable. Competence didn't need titles to be effective. Service without glory was still service, and often the most meaningful kind. As Eliza walked back toward the simulator facility that would soon become a training center, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that her suffering had found purpose, that her wingman's sacrifice would live on through every pilot she prepared for survival. The pilot had returned to the cockpit, and she was bringing with her the promise that excellence would be recognized, competence would be valued, and service would be honored regardless of who provided it. Winters' campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value, transforming a simulator technician into an instructor whose influence would echo through aviation culture for generations. The war was over, and truth had triumphed over prejudice. But for Eliza, the real victory was just beginning, the chance to serve openly, to honor her fallen wingmen, and to ensure that future pilots would be better prepared for the challenges that awaited them in a world where precision meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag. 6 months after Winters' departure, Sunnydale Air Force Base had transformed into something approaching Eliza's vision of military excellence. The training programs she established emphasized fundamentals that went beyond technical competence to tactical wisdom, preparing pilots not just to fly their aircraft, but to think like warriors who understood that survival depended on attention to detail and respect for their instruments. Eliza's morning routine had evolved but retained its essential character. She still arrived at 4:30 sharp, still performed her ritual of remembrance, but now her presence served a different purpose. Instead of calibrating simulators in solitude, she prepared to share knowledge that had been earned through terrible cost with pilots who deserved to benefit from her experience. The training facility that had once been a simple simulator bay now housed some of the most advanced flight instruction available anywhere in the Air Force. Eliza had designed courses that challenged conventional thinking about aviation, incorporating lessons learned in combat environments that textbooks couldn't capture. Her students called her Ms. Reyes with a reverence that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with results. She deflected their attempts at hero worship with practiced ease, focusing instead on fundamentals that could save their lives in situations she prayed they would never face. Excellence isn't about being perfect, she told each new class. It's about being prepared, about understanding your aircraft so completely that it becomes an extension of yourself, about maintaining standards even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. The lessons went beyond flying to encompass leadership, judgment, and the kind of thinking that separated technicians from artists. Eliza taught breathing techniques that calmed racing hearts in emergencies, visualization that turned pressure into precision, and most importantly, the mental discipline that enabled pilots to perform when everything went wrong. Her influence extended far beyond the simulator bay. The culture of Sunnydale had shifted subtly but significantly in ways that honored competence over connections, results over rhetoric. Other civilian specialists found themselves treated with increased respect as people began to understand that expertise came in many forms. Colonel Alvarez visited regularly, ostensibly to review training protocols, but actually to witness the transformation Eliza had brought to the base. The decline in simulator discrepancies had been dramatic and immediate. More importantly, pilots trained under her programs demonstrated measurably improved performance in combat simulations and qualification courses. "She's exceeded every expectation," Alvarez reported to his superiors. Reyes has created training programs that prepare pilots for challenges they might face in combat environments. The improvement in precision, discipline, and tactical thinking has been remarkable. The young female pilot who had first asked Eliza for guidance became her most dedicated student and eventually her assistant instructor. Lieutenant Sofia Ramirez absorbed lessons that went far beyond flight controls and navigation, learning about leadership, service, and the difference between commanding respect and earning it. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" Ramirez asked during one of their morning preparation sessions. Eliza's answer reflected the wisdom she had gained through loss and service. That true aviators don't seek danger, they seek excellence, understanding that sometimes excellence is required in dangerous situations. When threats arise, real warriors don't announce their presence with boasts or bravado. They simply do what must be done with competence and humility. The shadow box that Alvarez had given her remained in the training facility, a reminder and inspiration for students who studied the medals and ribbons that represented service beyond anything they had experienced. One asked about a particular commendation, its meaning lost in military symbolism that existed at classification levels they would never reach. "That's a reminder," Eliza explained, "that honor doesn't need announcement. Every medal in that box represents a moment when doing the right thing mattered more than who got credit. The real reward was coming home when others didn't, carrying their memory forward in how we serve." The leather case remained in her apartment, but its meaning had evolved. The wings still rested inside, worn smooth by years of handling, but they no longer represented just loss and guilt. They had become symbols of purpose, driving her to ensure that future pilots would be better prepared for the challenges that claimed her wingmen. On quiet mornings when fog clung to the airfield like memory, Eliza took to the skies in training aircraft that no student witnessed. The planes spoke their ancient language of physics and freedom, responding to controls that felt like extensions of her own body. She flew these patterns not to maintain skills that would never again be used in combat, but to honor promises made to the dead. Each perfect maneuver represented a life that continued to matter, a soul whose sacrifice shaped every lesson she taught. The names she whispered during those solitary flights had found new purpose, their memory living on through every pilot she prepared for survival. News of Winter's final disposition reached Sunnydale through official channels that carried no satisfaction, only closure. Her military career had ended with administrative separation and documentation that would follow her forever. She had learned in the most painful way possible the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it. But Eliza's thoughts about winters had evolved beyond simple justice to something approaching pity. She had destroyed her own career through prejudice and insecurity, had missed the opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise exceeded her own understanding. Her loss was complete and self-inflicted, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting assumption override observation. The real victory wasn't winter's defeat, but the transformation of Sunnydale into a place where excellence was recognized and nurtured regardless of its source. Eliza's influence extended through every pilot she trained, every instructor she mentored, every standard she established that emphasized precision over politics. Years later, when Eliza's time at Sunnydale drew to a close, her departure was marked not by ceremony but by absence. She left the way she had arrived, quietly and without fanfare. But the program she established continued. The standards she set endured, and the culture she influenced lived on through generations of pilots who carried her lessons into service. Somewhere in a small town far from any military base, an instructor named Eliza teaches flying to civilian students with the same patient dedication she brought to training warriors. She never mentions her past unless directly relevant, never trades on former glory for present respect. Her students know her as an exceptional teacher with an uncanny ability to diagnose and correct flying problems. Nothing more. The pilot still whispers in quiet moments, one name carried forever. But it no longer defines her present or limits her future. It has become a source of strength rather than a symbol of failure, driving her to excellence in service of those who trust their lives to skills she helps them develop. Do you believe true strength speaks louder than words? Eliza Reyes' journey from legendary pilot to humble instructor reminds us that the greatest aviators often fight their most important battles in silence, measuring victory not in accolades, but in the lives they touch and the service they render without recognition. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step back from the spotlight and use our expertise to illuminate the path for others. Her story echoes through Sunnydale and beyond, a reminder that heroes walk among us in unexpected forms. The quiet technician, the patient instructor, the colleague who never speaks of their past. Each might carry histories of extraordinary service, masked by ordinary presence. Eliza chose anonymity over acclaim, teaching over commanding, service over self. In doing so, she embodied the highest ideals of aviation culture, proving that true strength needs no announcement, only application. The morning sun casts long shadows across empty runways and busy training facilities, across institutions where future aviators learn their craft and quiet workspaces where expertise meets humility. Eliza Reyes continues her work one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one act of service at a time. The pilot may have died in Afghanistan, but what rose from that tragedy was something more powerful than any legend. A teacher who understood that the greatest victory lies not in defeating enemies, but in preparing others to protect what matters most. Her shadow stretches long across the landscape of military culture, a reminder that true aviators serve not for glory, but for those who cannot serve themselves. And when that service is complete, they fade back into the shadows where legends live, content in the knowledge that their duty continues through every life they have touched, every standard they have set, every lesson they have taught about the difference between excellence and expectation, between service and self-promotion, between earning respect and demanding it. The legacy lives on, whispered through the ranks, of pilots who learned precision from someone who understood its life or death importance, carried forward by instructors who teach with the patience of someone who knows that preparation prevents tragedy, embodied in the culture of institutions that value competence over connections and results over rhetoric. Eliza Reyes proved that true strength lies not in proving our worth to critics, but in continuing our work regardless of recognition. That the most powerful response to disrespect might be the quiet dignity of competence. That excellence speaks through actions, not arguments, and that the greatest aviators are often those who serve without fanfare, teach without ego, and measure success by the lives they help save rather than the glory they achieve. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.